welcome to another episode of InIIS InSIGHTS. My name is Roy Canada, Academic Director of the Institute of Intercultural and International Studies at the University of Bremen. As you know, in this podcast, we cover major contemporary crises like wars and interventions, diplomacy, international organizations, dynamics of mobilization and escalation, as well as contentious politics, and last not least, new ideas in the field of political and social theory. We have rarely covered so far more historical topics, and given that I see myself somewhere between international relations and historical sociology, I am more than happy about today's topic and session. For this one, we have with us Stefan Ihrig, Professor of History at the University of Haifa in Israel, where he has been since 2016, Haifa that is. He had already been in Israel as postdoctoral scholar at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem from 2013 and has stayed in Israel since, after having received his PhD at Cambridge University. And he is known mostly to us for his much lauded monograph, Turks in the Nazi Imagination from 2014, which was published with the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. This book was widely discussed in international and in German circles. And afterwards, he had focused more on the Armenian genocide debates, and on this he wrote his second monograph, Justifying Genocide, Germany and the Armenians from Bismarck to Hitler, published in 2016. Next to his academic work, you will find regular commentaries from him. Just this week, there was one piece out in Haaretz on the decision by the Israeli government to formally recognize the Armenian genocide, a decision that Stefan judges as, and I quote here, a right move, but for very wrong reasons, end of quote, meaning he also contributes to the ongoing discussions on the politics of and diplomacy of genocide and genocide recognition in the past decades. And on this, comparing Turkey and Israel makes for an interesting analysis, so to speak. For example, on Bosnia, Turkey does recognize the genocide, Israel does not. On the Armenians, Israel does now, Turkey never did. On Palestinians in Gaza, Turkey does, Israel does not. On the Yazidis in Iraq, both don't, interestingly. And on the Rohingya in Myanmar, Turkey does, Israel does not. Anyway, that's not the topic of today, but the topic of today is rather Stefan's third monograph that has just come out. It is called Germans and Turks, A Forgotten History of Europe, published with Bloomsbury. Now, when I occasionally give public talks about German-Turkish relations, about German and Turkish foreign policies toward each other or toward other conflicts in Middle East politics, I usually start with the notion that these two countries share something of a Schicksalsgemeinschaft. For German ears, like with so many German terms, this sounds much more than the English community of fate, but that's another topic. And by that, I mean that the future of these two countries is a common one. When speaking of the one, this means also speaking about the other, and you can never separate these two again anymore. Now, this may sound too much for German ears, especially in these times of things shifting more and more to the right in politics, in society, in culture. Anyway, I always have this common future in mind, and by that I reproduce an image or a type of knowledge that follows a very established historiography that says, yes, there were, of course, years of these deep diplomatic connections between Germany and Turkey, between the German Reich and the Ottoman Empire in past decades, but that the real connection has been established with the waves of migration after 1960. And now going through this book is a massive corrective for that, and also to me, because here we see a presentation of a narrative of 1,000 years of relations, interactions, conflict, cooperation, enmity and amity, of places of living together, of much more of a shared history, shared experience than even I had thought of. Now, there have been other attempts in the past to somehow offer a corrective with regard to the place of Turks, of Ottomans, of Muslims in Europe. To name just one, by Emily Gerbe in 2021 in her book Muslims and the Making of Modern Europe. but I read this one quite differently because here is a demonstration about something where there is seemingly nothing weird, nothing new, nothing out of the ordinary for people from Germany and Turkey to interact with one another. And yeah, I welcome you to the session, Stefan. It's really great to have you to talk about this.
Thank you, Roy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'd like to start with that. So it would really interest me to hear from you what actually triggered you to write such an account in the first place.
I mean, as you mentioned already, one of the most important times for German-Turkish relations is certainly once Turks start immigrating to Germany after World War II, especially from the 60s onward. So for me, actually coming to all these topics has always been this kind of post-war German prism of how you look at this large group living in Germany. And for me, even growing up already with Turkish friends, this whole question of, kind of the racism Turks face in Germany has always been a motivator for all of my work. And going back from, focusing on the 20th century and the 19th century, I was interested also to show how, these relations develop over a longer period of time. And, as a historian who's also interested in historiography and history politics, I was especially interested in countering this idea of projecting things way into the past. And I think, for me, one of the things, that was important in this book to show is that for a lot of times, relations between Germans and Turks, and their states is much more influenced by what is called realpolitik, in the kind of, yeah, and that's ironic, perhaps Bismarckian fashion, than it was about essentialist kind of feelings, like religion, nation, and so on. And yeah, for me, it was very important also to kind of give a kind of different foundation for whatever comes next and what is already happening to a large degree in the last decades, a different new kind of German-Turkish normality, be it in the form of, Turks in Germany, German Turks, however you want to phrase that, people of Turkish background, becoming much more important, much more visible in Germany. And there is this thing I also really like to conceptualize German history from the 60s, but most definitely from the 70s onward as being co-written by the Turks as well. I think that's an important kind of metaphor way of looking at these things.
When you talked about this work, was it weird to convince other people why we need such a book or such a thousand-year perspective?
Well, a thousand years sounds horrible in many ways, and the hubris of a historian trying to do that, that is for sure. But as you mentioned also in your introduction, there are these books that offer us this kind of expected perspective on this long duration of history. And Germany is different in so many aspects. Already when Edward Said's Orientalism came out, it was voiced as a criticism that he didn't look enough at Germany and that Germany was different. And I think my book can show that, up until the 1960s, I would say, that this whole notion of Edward Said's Orientalism simply doesn't apply to Germany. And this, of course, raises bigger questions. Was it not that, for much of the history, German-Turkish relations were the most important, basically, nexus between Europe and the Muslim world. The Ottoman Empire also being the seat of the Caliphate, of claiming a leadership role within the Muslim world and being protector of the holy cities. It raises bigger questions, I really think. And, one of the trends in Turkey has been in the last, I would say, 20, perhaps even 30 years, to kind of put this Saidian view of Orientalism and post-colonial studies also on German-Turkish relations, which I think pushes things too far. I think it's accurate to look at the great powers in general and their interaction with the late Ottoman Empire in this kind of colonial penetration and semi-colonial dependence, what do you say, perspective. But Germany is weirdly different in all these things, weirdly different. You know, for example, the Baghdad Railway always comes up, and there are so many ways to frame a discussion of that. But to simply put the label colonial penetration on the Baghdad Railway is wrong, I think, because, you know, if you look in the constituting documents, how it was envisaged this scheme would work, then you see already it's mainly about supporting the Ottoman state, supporting the Ottomans' penetration into their own territory. It was about building army barracks along the way, about communication, telegraph lines, like they did when they built railway lines in the American West. It also had these provisions in there that in times of war, all of the rolling stock of the Baghdad Railway would immediately revert to the Ottoman Empire. And then also up until the day of the outbreak of World War One, the Germans labored hard to get Russia and Great Britain on board as much as, you know, they wouldn't object really to it anymore. In the beginning, they always wanted really a truly transnational consortium also to be behind it. So, you know, there already you have this very prominent topic, which I think is often just misread and put into certain categories. But all of that doesn't mean that Said is wrong when it comes to Turkey and Germany, as I would argue, and as I do in the book. In the 1960s, there is basically, you know, almost 1,000 years, hundreds and hundreds of years of common and shared history quickly forgotten from the German side, and there is something like Orientalism on speed, and the Turks in Germany become like the typical other, and all these views of looking at Muslim immigrants as they are, you know, and we have a lot of research on these things, of course, you know, very dominant in societies like France and Great Britain, also become very current and very, what do you say, operative in Germany in these decades.
So depicting the other with the wrong history or a wrong identity to be able to fit into Europe is one thing. The other, where your book offers a nice corrective, is that we seemingly also have forgotten ourselves, like our Germans have forgotten about a long part of their history of interactions with people from Turkey, people from the Ottoman Empire, etc. So what would you say is the thing that was most forgotten, where when you delved into it, maybe even you thought, even I was not aware of this particular dynamic or so?
What was surprising to me is there are so many instances across history where people of German and Turkish backgrounds do interact and, you know, cohabit and probably cooperate. There's this one instance, you know, Marco Polo already describes that there are, you know, present next to each other basically in the Mongol Empire. There are instances of recorded instances of Germans or people of German background and Turkish backgrounds living in Constantinople before the Ottoman conquest, for example. And that's a long time ago, and there are people there interacting, cohabiting, and, you know, this is also part of historical normality always. And then, you know, if you move a little bit more forward in time, you know, at some point, what is called in English Transylvania and in German Siebenbürgen, this area in today's Romania, you know, once was a prime destination for settlers, especially from the German speaking countries. And, you know, as, you know, history developed, it became part of the Ottoman Empire, rather autonomous part of the Ottoman Empire, but Ottoman Empire nonetheless. So you did have, territories with German-speaking majorities even living within the Ottoman Empire. And then there is this one instance where actually, Ottoman troops, Ottoman soldiers, and Germans in the city of Sibiu, then called Hermannstadt, a German city at the time, have to fight against enemies outside the city, are under siege for months, and you know, commit these daring raids outside the city walls together, Germans and Turks. And that's also, again, a long time ago. And, you could delve more into Austrian and Habsburg history, where there are also many instances of, kind of realpolitik or, getting along when the time requires it, And this is even, beyond the normal bilateral relations, where also, throughout history, there is much more of this kind of common sense. We're looking for our state's interest and we are cooperating in all different kinds of fields. And this you find even before entering the 19th century, where you have much more prominent examples of that. So, if people are constructing and projecting back, a Muslim Christian enmity through history, there is also there are many correctives to that view anyway. And as always, as it is with history, memory, history, politics, we need to ask ourselves who's doing the constructing and why, and what is the specific point to which they're speaking.
Maybe more concretely with regard to your earlier work. I mean, where you had time frames of, I don't know, 2, 3 decades for your book on Ataturk in the Nazi imagination, or then 7 to 8 decades from Bismarck to Hitler with regard to conceptions about Armenians in the German-Turkish relationship. What changes when you now adopt this longue durée perspective with regard to these smaller temporal frames you had in your earlier books?
I mean, the thing, if you look at Ataturk in the Nazi imagination, I mean, the the far right in Germany in the 1920s and the Nazis specifically, they were excited about Turkey for their own reasons as well. And they were able to be excited about Turkey because they were acquainted with Turkey. And many of those people actually, writing op-eds or speaking about Turkey had a long personal history of engagement with Turkey. Some of them even had spent time in Turkey. And then, as you said, the other book dealing with the Armenian topic and Germany, and specifically how Germany dealt with that topic, what it knew, and how it kind of digested violence against the Armenians over time. It also builds on this foundation in almost each and every case that people were well acquainted with the Ottoman Empire, with its history, its people. So, already there you have this longer duration of history. You cannot just start with Bismarck or something. There's always something coming before. And yes, it all becomes, on the one hand, very relative because, there are these ups and downs and there are these instances of more proximity and more distance throughout time. But, you could really force the argument and say, there is a kind of a special relationship here. There is a huge distance to be overcome geographically, but it is being overcome and also culturally and when it comes to knowledge again and again throughout history. I mean, there is this point, and this is something I found really quite baffling that you have the age of exploration, you have the discovery of North America, and Europe is still much more focused, if not obsessed, with the Ottoman Turks. There is many instances and contexts where knowing about the Ottoman Empire was just more important and exciting than knowing about what's going on in Northern America, which is quite weird, looking back from our perspective today. But anyway, bottom line for me is Germans and Turks have been much closer throughout, the last few hundred years. And there is something there that, if we are using history for something that can be used also in a much more positive sense. And I think it is important for Germany, which is largely ignorant kind of this long duration of its relations, even though all the different pieces are known and should be known. I mean, the wars against the Turks, from in basically early modern times, especially when they were in front of Vienna and all these things, they are known, but sometimes in these discourses and projections, this kind of timeline gets a little bit distorted and parts of it forgotten.
I think this is maybe the strongest corrective or the strongest offer in this, that this may be forgotten because this is then considered part of the empire that's the Habsburg dynasty sets up, which develops into Austria-Hungary, and then it's not a German experience anymore. It's somewhat a Southeastern Europe, Balkan experience of then, I don't know, governing Muslims or getting rid of the Ottoman Muslims in the course of what you then reframe as the Southeastern Reconquista. So maybe that's that, and maybe that's now the corrective of maybe being bold in framing this as a German experience based on the interactions that German-speaking people had back then. So maybe that's why it's forgotten, because it's been framed as a history of states and empires, but not of people in their interactions.
Since German history in the center of Europe is very complicated, sometimes it's easy not to take let's say, a pan-Germanic view on history, and it's easy to put some things on the Austrians when it doesn't suit us. But there's a whole different way to look at it. As you said, for a lot of time it makes sense to focus on people and kind of also, you could say, even intellectual spheres when it comes to printing and publishing and talking about things more than states. And the German experience is basically, the prime example for that, because the nation states come so late in history. But there's also basically another way to look at it from the other end of it all. You could make the argument, and I do, and I always would, that Germany today is also a post-Ottoman state, because we have so many populations living in Germany. Of course, the same is true for Austria as well, coming from the former Ottoman realm, you could say, in its most extended form. I mean, there is, of course, the core of people from Turkey. As we know, they also have different ethnic backgrounds. That means also different kind of family histories. If you have even an ethnic Turk from Turkey, his family probably has some sort of migration and a background as well, coming from the Balkans, the Caucasus, or some other place. But Germany also includes today people and their families from various Balkan countries, Northern Africa, ethnic Germans from all these different parts. So if you are an ethnic German whose family comes from, let's say, Dobruja or Bessarabia, from the Romanian extended space, then, your family perhaps lived next to Turks, Muslims, different Turkic peoples, Tatars, Gagauz, I don't know, and so on in their past as well. So, Germany cannot just look from Bremen or Berlin at this space, but needs to also remember its own complicated history with this continent. And, that's the thing, really. There is this period, when the Ottomans are basically sitting in Hungary, where the German-speaking space in Europe touches directly with the Ottomans. And there is this long period, there is all these wars, but it's basically, as I call it, a grand military standoff. It's basically something like a much longer lasting Cold War at the center of Europe. And of course, this shapes, opinions, shapes the flow of knowledge, and it's quite a shame that all this is forgotten today to a large degree, at least by the public. Of course, historians of this area know and publish about this. But, this is something, if you think about it, a long period of enmity and war, where on the German side, they had to do anti-Turkish propaganda all the time to raise money for the armies and for the fortifications, against the Ottoman space. And this had to be overcome, to reach a point in the late 19th century, where Germany was thinking that, a friendship and an alliance with the Ottomans is the way out of all the complications that Germany is facing in Europe. And, it's not just realpolitics and, egotistic kind of statecraft to lean onto the Ottomans. There were people who were really essentialist believers in this, a future together of Germans and Turks, and that the Turks are basically the Germans of the Orient, and that we have to help them, and this brings our German salvation in the future, and all of that, and this is still just, going into the complicated 20th century, where again we have distance and proximity. I mean, there is what I describe in Ataturk and the Nazi Imagination and in Justifying Genocide, this basically infatuation with the extreme policies associated with the Young Turks, and then also with the war and revisionism of Ataturk and this creation of a new Turkey. But then there are also, of course, refugees from Nazism who find their place in Turkey. This is, of course, a story that was reactivated already decades ago in Germany, because it also was important as a corrective, to show Germans, look, Turkey not so long ago helped out Germans and, basically was on the side of the righteous, while Germans were doing quite the opposite. But, here again, you have this deep personal connections with people like Ernst Reuter, most famous, being in Turkey, being grateful, but also influencing Turkish society, and also kind of seeding further relations between Germans and Turks for the decades to come. And, all of this story, and then you have Turks coming to Germany as guest workers in this scheme, and they carry this with them, basically. There is empirical proof that, they came to Germany and knew of this, long duration of shared history together, and are faced with the German counterparts who either were ignorant or chose to forget about it because it didn't really suit the needs of the moment anymore.
And another, what I found, yeah, almost comic in the book were these interactions between German politicians in the 19th century and then as members of the Ottoman diplomatic corps, Germans who had become Turkified and who had a history of migrating to the Ottoman Empire, and their rising in administrative service, even diplomatic service, and then being on the side of the Ottoman state in diplomatic interactions with Bismarck, who was seemingly very offended by having to deal with this ethnic German on the other side.
Yeah, so that's another part of the story, and it also has this long duration to it. That the Ottoman Empire exercised quite a fascination also for other reasons in the German-speaking countries and also in other places, because it was seen to be based on meritocracy. Anybody could basically rise according to their abilities high up in state and society. This attracted people we used to call renegades. A colleague of mine, Tobias Graf, wrote a book about how these people then also kept connections to their families in different societies in Europe after they became Ottoman, and also after they rose up in the ranks. And this also applied to Germans, of course. And this is a trend, basically, this making a life in the Ottoman Empire up until World War One. And that's quite fascinating. And, when the Ottomans were, menacing Central Europe and, coming to plunder and raid German-speaking villages, there was also this other side, kind of a Turk hope, they used to call it, where people The nobility was especially afraid that the peasants would, fall victim to this Turkish hope. Why not submit to the Sultan, live in peace and harmony, have your religion protected, and if you chose so, convert to Islam and rise high up in the ranks. And this here already you can see how the Ottoman Empire, and this is also that becomes a thing, comes be kind of a mirror of your own society, and you can look at your own nobility and ruling classes, and then contrast what you want to see in the Ottoman Empire, or what is also to a degree factual there, and counterposit this to what's happening at home.
This may also be seen as a nice contrast to, I don't know, the more negative experiences when it comes to German-Turkish cooperation. I mean, you specifically refer to that in your earlier books. So usually in the 20th century, the cooperation of these two camps, is not beneficial for minorities in the Ottoman Empire, in the Turkish Republic, the Armenians from the 1890s to the genocide in World War One, and then also you refer to that in your in the later chapters on Kurdish relations in Germany. So Kurds being that could be considered as victims of more German-Turkish cooperation, where German weapons are used by the Turkish army to fight its war against the PKK, but also to oppress the Kurdish population in general. So it's an interesting and nice. I mean, it's not a corrective. I mean, these experiences did happen, but that is stuff to work upon for the future, where this cooperation is not perceived by others as damaging.
Well, we could go further when it comes to, let's say, the early 20th century, when you say, it hasn't been positive in its outcome for the minorities in the Ottoman Empire, but it also hasn't been very positive for basically the majority population. If you look at World War One and how that was conducted, and again, that's something that Germans today don't really have on their radar. It was quite a user mentality from the German side. Once World War One starts, the German needs in the war are supreme. The Ottomans feel they don't have much of a choice but to go along, first of all, enter the war. It feels to them that there is no option of just sitting it out and waiting what's going to happen. And since they don't even have the financial means to keep an army basically in uniform, let alone carry out major operations and, feed their own populations in time of war with blockade and everything, the Ottoman leadership is entirely dependent on Germany. And this breeds already relatively fast a lot of mistrust and bad feelings from the Ottoman side towards the Germans. And the behavior of Germany is quite reckless there, I would say, and it's not only when it comes to the Armenians and the Christian minorities and, the Armenian genocide and all of that, but also more in general. I mean, it's famous Ataturk, intervened and protested a few times about what the Germans want of the Ottomans during World War One. And he had one of his early communications on the subject. He's saying a defensive strategy would have been better for the Ottoman Empire, and this is absolutely and empirically correct. This is where the Ottoman Empire is strong in World War One, but the Germans, push always towards more dangerous and offensive operations. And this is just, one of these many aspects there. There is an argument to be made that Germany needs to be kind of aware of how much of, user mentality is the word we normally use for these circumstances, how German fascination and friendship with Turkey can flip into something that is quite negative. It's not that this pattern repeats in guest worker dynamics. It's a new thing for sure, but it's also very abusive, you have to say, at its very core. I make a lot out of it, and I think it's justified. This famous sentence, we called workers and humans came. it's very perverse in a way. And it was written in a satirical fashion, but for these people coming, it was clear that they are humans. And it's really quite shocking that it took German society and politics decades to really understand that, yes, humans came. We have been basically, let's say, subject to migration that we instigated and continuously reaffirmed, but haven't really been able to come up with policies to actually make good use of immigration because, humans are a capital for a society and a state. And instead, Germany, and when you talked about motivators, this is something I grew up with in Germany. Instead, German politicians, including Helmut Kohl, but also people from the Social Democrats, constantly ostracized German Turks, constantly railed against them, tried to win votes, basically on the back of these people who, with the other immigrants in post World War II society, built Germany and made basically the new post-war Germany possible. So, there is quite a lot of tragedy in these relationships. There's quite a lot of open wounds there. And, over time, and because, they are now part of German normality, third, fourth, fifth generation Germans of these backgrounds, that will happen anyway, no matter what books we write.
I mean, yeah, I knew some of the really bad quotes that even Social Democrats had back then. So Helmut Schmidt in the early 80s. But I was actually coming from Schleswig-Holstein. I was shocked that Björn Engholm also makes it into your book with not a nice quote on Turks in Germany being considered as dangerous from a racist perspective. That was rather new to me.
You could write horrible anthologies if look through the media of these decades. This is also another thing that, you mentioned my previous books. I also published another monograph in German on post-Soviet Moldova. And before that, with two colleagues of mine, we did an analysis of the debates about Turkish EU membership, around the summit of Copenhagen, now 25 years ago. And, also there, this kind of, how easy it is to talk about the Turks as if they were not in the room as well. And I'm not even speaking about, kind of globalized media and, Turkey being present as a country in Germany. But, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, if you look at public discourse in Germany, it feels like, it's mostly Germans talking, ethnic Germans, as if there are no Turks ever in the room. And this is quite shocking how long this persists, even though, Turkish, both guest workers, Turkish intellectuals try to participate in the debate. They have their voices. German, Turkish, there are sociologists publishing reports and things, and they get ignored for a long time. And it's like you have this kind of imagine German society talking amongst itself about the other as if they were not there, were not also, kind of consuming these discourses and weren't aware of them and didn't have a voice themselves. And that's quite harsh, I have to be honest, to work through these decades and see that because it's a kind of form of discursive violence that's taking place there. And, I don't know what is the latest debate where we can see this in the last years, but it's something that's not entirely gone yet. This kind of, I see you and you are different, and why are you not integrating? Why are you doing this and such? But it is changing, of course, it is now. But
Mhm.
it took painfully long, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, we're about to come to the end. I mean, this we are at an interesting time. You end with a lot of the racist violence, the killings, the NSU, etc. in one of that last chapters, and you leave it, of course, quite open as a historian where this will develop in these next years, and rightly so. And maybe the new thing is that at least in the composition of material power, I don't know, political power, diplomatic power, military power, economic power, these countries are much more at par. I mean, Germany is still strong, still more powerful in the world, and still more dominating, etc. But Turkey is not the Turkey of the 60s and 70s, overly dependent on money to be sent back from Germany for its own economic and state making purposes, etc. Right? Turkey is a powerful player in global politics also, and that, of course, also determines how this relationship unfolds. And at least that hierarchy or inequality is not as starkly expressed, which usually is the material basis for the opportunity to have powerful Orientalist practices and discourses in place. I mean, for Said, it's the material inequality which is the starting point for all the crazy talk and I don't know, phantasmas and imaginations of the other. So at least that may be over. That doesn't mean that things will not stay complicated, because they currently are, and a lot of that is also from the side where, yeah, the Turkish state does not have to take things anymore the way it had as in the past.
Look, I like to focus on the horrible parts of history, but I'm an eternal optimist. So also in this regard, I'm very optimistic when it comes to German-Turkish relations because, we used the word corrective now a few times, and these deep and personal and family connections that exist, and then there is also always cross migration across the generations, basically. I have friends I went to high school with who are now in Istanbul, who were from families from Turkey originally anyway, but born and grew up in Germany. And then, there were opportunities, especially in the boom years, in the early boom years of Erdogan's Turkey. And this happens, of course, all the time. So you have lots of people on both sides who have much more intimate knowledge and who act as kind of various thousands, millions little strings that tie these two countries, and to a degree also the same for Austria is true, together. And, I believe that, this will also help Germany and it will also help Turkey in the long run to have all these little connections to other places. I mean, there is a lot of dangerous stuff going on too. Of course, the reach of Erdogan into Turkish-German society through various institutions, spreading discourses of conspiracy, anti-Semitism, anti-Westernism, and all of that. But then corrective, a term we use a lot now in this conversation, there are also so many others, and there are so many different layers of connections between the two countries that I have to say I'm really quite optimistic.
All right, let's close with that and be optimistic for the time. And yeah, thank you very much for this, Stefan. And yeah, can only recommend this book to all the listeners. And yeah, I will propagate this among friends and colleagues. So Germans and Turks, right? Nice book. Congratulations on this, Stefan.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me, Roy.
All right.